The protagonist is from India. He sailed on the SS Roma to England in 1964. He went to Boston 5 years later for a job at MIT. A marriage was arranged for him. The story begins in America, 1969. The protagonist decided that America is the final continent. He came to this country and chose it because of the opportunities it offers, as embodied in Americans reaching the moon. With education, as shown in the protagonist taking a job at MIT, one could enrich their mind and knowledge to pursue the American dream. Many have walked that path and many succeeded, but not without its difficulties. Xenophobia, exclusion, and oftentimes the inability to adapt to a new environment. In pursuit of opportunities, they have become an outsider. In this book, the theme of being an outsider is pervasive and emphasized. For an example, an Indian woman's sari, a traditional Indian headcloth, was seized by a dog because it dragged on the ground. But two characters best exemplify the life of an outsider, the protagonist and Mrs. Croft. The protagonist's marriage was arranged for him. His wife, Mala, wept on their first night together because of her separation with her parents. They still had a significant distance between them even after Mala came to America. One could say that the protagonist was an outsider in his own marriage. The protagonist's mother was mentioned frequently. She became deranged after the death of her husband, the protagonist's father. She became isolated from her family, living in a world of her own. One could say that the protagonist is an outsider, unable to reach out and communicate with his mother. Mrs. Croft was the eccentric landlady whom the protagonist described as ancient. She was 103 years old. Just as the protagonist and Mala had their share of cultural shock. As a foreigner, Mrs. Croft's age inevitably placed her in an era with customs and behavior she could not comprehend. Despite living in America her whole life, the evolution of society outpaced her capability to adapt. She belonged to another era, an era devoid of automobiles, airplanes, and television, an era where the moon was unreachable, an era where no man even dreamed of doing so. She was an outsider in her own country, her own home. Just as Mala and the protagonist carried over customs and mindsets from their own culture, Mrs. Croft remained rooted to the cultural expectations of her time. She scolded her daughter for being in the same room unaccompanied with another man, despite her daughter being over 60 years old. Oddly, she formed a unique bond with the protagonist. Her daughter, Helen, mentioned to the protagonist that Mrs. Croft considered him a gentleman. Perhaps the protagonist's timidness and oftentimes confusion at Mrs. Croft's eccentricity was interpreted as respect. Because the protagonist did not know America well, he followed Mrs. Croft's requests. Neither of them understood the proper etiquette in their contemporary society. Both of them outsiders, and both of them learned to appreciate each other's company. Everything is relative philosophically. When two people are outside of the same box, some invisible boundary preventing them from entering, they find themselves standing together, facing the same plight. They form their own group, community, family. The immigrants that first came to this country had a similar experience. They were outsiders, but not in the eyes of other outsiders. They shared the same goal, the same struggle, the same dream. The American dream.